Welcome to this third session in this series. And this session, we're going to talk about the third process of maturation. That's integration. Here, integration is maturing as a result of experiencing our emotions, our thoughts, experiencing them together and having an inner dissonance or conflict inside. This is the key to becoming a social being, and the development of virtues. Virtues like self-control and patience and courage, consideration, forgiveness and sacrifice. So our definition for integration that we're going to use is a mixing without blending. What then is the difference between mixing and blending? Aren't they the same thing? Well, here for us they're going to be different. We're going to define mixing as a combining of parts into a whole, whereby the parts can still be identified and separated out. That's quite different from blending. Blending is you mix the parts together to create something new, but you can't separate out the parts anymore. This we call fusion. Now, for examples, we see an integration in 1 Corinthians. Paul says, "Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it." So there's a mixing, but you can still separate out the individual members. So in this chapter, Paul's teaching on the spiritual gifts as they cooperate to empower God's will for the church. The Christian church is like the human body. We have one body made up of all these different parts that serve a wide variety of functions. All those functions matter. They're important. Likewise, we are individual members, but we're also part of one body. It's a togetherness without the loss of separateness. And quite often in the church, we define this as unity.
And I think this really is a process that we identify as maturity. When we see an individual or a group that is able to have that integration, that mixing without blending, I think that's really a sign of growing maturity.
Mm-hmm. I think when we see a church community that is separate, but then they're all together as well. Mm-hmm. Yes, they have this unity, this cohesion about it. You walk in and you know there's something different. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So integration develops in stages, and each stage relatively depends on the previous stage. And first, for a baby, the senses develop first. So if we think of just sight, how sight develops. In the first 6 months, the baby is able to focus on objects and see colour, but they just do this one eye at a time. They can't yet see distance. Only when they can see through each eye can the brain bring the images together to start to see distance. This happens in the second 6 months of a baby's life. It takes time for the brain to develop and interpret that distance, and then to respond appropriately by reaching out and grabbing things. I knew one friend when I was working in television. He only had vision from one eye. The other eye, the vision was poor. Mm-hmm. There was some there, but it was quite poor. And so subconsciously, the way his brain got around it is he tilted his head from side to side as he drove.
To compensate to
mm-hmm. see distance. Mm-hmm. And so
the way our eyes integrate the image in our brain.
And so his brain was able to find a workaround to still be able to judge distance. He said intersections especially were really challenging for him. Yeah.
Wow.
So this integration becomes our metaphor. We first see one perspective and then another. And when we're ready, we see both simultaneously. There is depth and balance to my perspective. So this happens for all the senses. So, for example, a baby at first can only experience the world through one sense at a time. And we as parents can use this to advantage. So let's say your baby absolutely loves the bath and they cry every time you take them out of the bath. So perhaps a minute or two before you take them out, you start singing to them. You take them from their sense world from the physical world to the auditory world through the music. And as you take them out of the bath, you keep singing to them. And for them, nothing has changed. The baby, you see, is only using one sense at a time. It's an either-or response. Cognitive development progresses in much the same way. For example, part of us knows that walking is good for us. Then part of us just doesn't want to go out in the rain or in the snow. This dissonance emerges around 5, but lots of adults don't feel this dissonance either. You see, it's a potential to develop integration, but it's not inevitable. So all of this balance and perspective, it doesn't always feel good. We might find ourselves arguing with ourselves, but that's exactly what's meant to happen.
Kind of like the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
Where he says basically he knows what to do, but he does the opposite.
That's that inner tension. I think a lot of teenagers today don't know that inner tension that they feel inside them is normal, it's healthy.
Yeah, that it's good.
We need to be able to tell them this is what's meant to happen.
Because it feels confusing. Very
confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah, for a teenager especially. The world is so confusing already, and then you have this on top of it.
Yeah.
But this balance and depth can only come as we allow this state within us. And so it takes a lot of time to grow. A lot of time for these things to come together.
Right.
So neuroscientists have discovered mixed emotions are even more significant than our conflicting ideas. Where, for example, we can say part of me is excited and part of me is afraid. The development of true courage. So just like the capacity for mixed thoughts, this emotional mixing also happens around 5
to 7.
7, that sort of age. Again, we all have the potential, but it's not inevitable. We can tell those that don't have mixed feelings because they're governed by their impulses. We see, for example, a child full of joy and curiosity, or a child who just melts down in a tantrum. So the 3-year-old. There's this relentless search for attention, perhaps, when feeling disconnected. So nature's answer to impulses is to match it with the opposite, a different emotion to come alongside. We'll look at some examples later in the session. The first sign of emotional integration that we feel is a pause. We may see it in a child, but quite often we'll feel it in ourselves as well. And this is a really good thing. This pause stops us from acting out of our impulses and hurting those we love. We get a chance to take control of our reactions. And that's what dissolves the power that the emotions have over us. So how does this pause feel when you engage with it? When you feel it happening ourselves? I had a situation where I was confronted as an adult by a leader. And they were looking for a why to my behavior. And in my mind, I was acting out of being true to myself, but they didn't like my reaction. And so they were questioning the relationship. And in that moment, I froze, I paused. There was a bit of a shock. So sometimes that pause is I'm not quite wanting to defend myself, because if I do that, I know I break the relationship. And I also value the relationship.
And what happens in that, whether it's a moment or moments of pause? Is it our brains searching for on the other hand?
It really is. Yeah. It's like, I know there's a way forward. I'm not quite sure what it was. And so my brain, instead of defending, started to invite the connection, started to invite the relationship.
Even though it was still challenging and it wasn't easy moving forward. You were able to kind of hold both.
The emotions inside me, the emotion to retaliate or defend, the aggressive emotion, and also the emotion that I care about this relationship. I was able to, the mind was bringing them together. It wasn't me doing it, it was my mind. Because I just felt a pause. It's like, I'm not quite sure how to answer yet.
Kind of froze almost?
Yeah, like a freeze, yeah. Sometimes if it's a frustration, you might pause. Instead of yelling at your child or hitting your child, you may pause for a moment and say, maybe there's a different perspective here. And you find
take a breath for a moment, or
take the breath. Yeah, we
back away from the situation.
Count to 10, all of those sorts of things. Yeah. Now, the ultimate piece of this is the social and cultural integration, where we can adapt to a very strong culture, a sense of togetherness, the language, the form, maybe the expression of that culture, and still be an individual, where the culture just doesn't crush us. I was thinking of a sporting team, so we can be such wrapped up in the culture, in the moment of cheering for our team, but have a little bit of a sense of still individuality, of control, of tempering our responses.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, to be able to function and hold close those that we love when we're apart from them.
Mm-hmm.
This is a separateness without the loss of togetherness. So when we're away on the trip, when we're away from home, that we don't forget our family. We remember them and we hold on to them, and we also give them things to hold on to us when we're apart. So it takes a lifetime to become mature. And there's always growing up to be done. It's our potential to grow up, but it's not inevitable. So we have another term for integration, and this is the term the Bible uses a lot, and that is tempered. You see here in Proverbs, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient or even-tempered calms a quarrel. But Jen, what does tempered mean?
Well, the word temper is from the Latin, which means to mix. And so, for example, if clay is well tempered, it would have a proper mix of sediment and sand and moisture. And our word that we use, temperature, is a scale from hot to cold, or a mix of temperatures.
So what then's a tempered person?
Well, as we've kind of touched on, it's a person who has one perspective, but also has another perspective to consider, or an emotion, as we've said, to counterbalance.
Mm-hmm. So this fundamentally sounds different from adaptation, from the previous process we're talking about. I think for adaptation, our minds are cutting something out. We're being transformed by what we cannot change. So it sounds here that integration is when we're bringing together a mix to create balance. Mm-hmm. We're bringing something together. I think when we understand this, we'll desire to be a well-tempered father, well-tempered husband, an even-tempered leader. We can live from both our heads and our hearts. We live in the middle of the mix. This is what it's like to be mature. So like in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, do not be children of your thinking, be infants in evil, but in your thinking be mature.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to just go back to aggression, and we talked about aggression in the last session as well. So when we're up against something that we cannot change, and we feel the futility, we have our sadness about that. This absolutely melts the impulsiveness. We found that from the last session.
Mm-hmm.
But here we see a second answer for aggression. There are times when we'll have a mix of emotions, and that will allow us to gain control as well. And here the impulsiveness is tempered. But what you'll notice here is we're not telling children to cut something out, like don't hit, don't cry, don't be mean. So, of course, we get frustrated.
We're still allowing the emotions.
Yes, we're allowing the frustrations to move us.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing is we're adding in.
Mm-hmm.
We're adding something in to temper the response.
So we can see when our kids, perhaps they're ready to punch their sibling.
Yeah.
Or, hopefully catch it before that. So then sort of prompt the other feeling. Like, do you also have love in your heart for your sister?
Yeah.
So sometimes it might be, nope, I've only got hits right now.
Yep.
But do you have hugs? Do you have, we can help them start to pay attention, especially when they're young.
Yeah.
They haven't brought that mix together yet. Not that they'll always choose the hugs.
No.
Right? We're not saying we'll never act out, act out
of the hits.
Our hits or our anger.
Our anger, our frustration. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But that's the maturity, is we've actually paused and can choose our way forward, not just have that impulsive.
The impulsiveness is then tempered.
Mm-hmm.
So neuroscience has shown there are two parts of the brain that play a key role in the emotional integration. The first is the prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain. So our amygdala, our emotional core, feeds in 2 shunts into the prefrontal cortex. But even though there's 2 shunts, the first 5 to 7 years of life, the amygdala only feeds in 1 feeling at a time. So it gives us time to develop the capacity to process feelings, to identify and differentiate those feelings and understand them. So only when we can do this does the brain start feeding in 2 at once. And so as we've been talking about, part of me wants to hit, but I don't want to get in trouble. Or part of me wants to procrastinate, but I don't want to fall behind. All of these mixed feelings are the key to a balanced, civilized, and stable behavior. It does take practice for this to grow, though. We need to process and reflect on the feelings. We have to exercise it like a muscle. And in neuroscience, it's shown that people who do practice actually have a larger prefrontal cortex. It actually does grow physically in size. They can actually measure it. We can start to practice this at any age. So we have lots of spiritual practices in our faith that can help us practice and grow to see different perspectives. So even if a child is neurodiverse and the brain has an injury, the brain's so motivated to find a way to fix this, for this mixing to happen, that it's going to actually look for unused real estate.
In the brain?
In the brain. So if there's even damage in the brain, it'll look for some place, unused real estate. And we've got lots of it.
Right. Or if we have neurodiverse, which that's not an injury, but if it finds kind of a workaround.
Yep. So perhaps like on the autism spectrum where the signals are mixed a little bit, it'll still try and find a way to get these 2 signals together.
So it's actually amazing that this happens as young as 5 years old.
It really
in a way,
is.
right? Like it's quite as we call it there, the executive functioning, right? It's quite a complex functioning of our brains to be able to do this.
And the teenager needs lots of practice bringing together different emotions because they're feeling new emotions again for the first time.
And intense feelings are more difficult to mix.
Yeah. And this should be obvious. Even as adults, we find these big feelings very difficult to regulate and process. These intense feeling takes a lot of energy. So we need our sleep. We need our food. So if we're tired, it's not a good time to make the big decisions in life. So routines and rituals are really helpful for us too, because then we don't have to be on all the time. So for the highly sensitive child, this is going to take even longer to develop, this working prefrontal cortex. So optimally, even 7 to 9 years of age, maybe even longer. And what we see for the highly sensitive is there might be a lot of reaction to sensory inputs. Perhaps the inputs like a light flickering or the clock ticking. But if you believe in the process, if you give it some room, if you work with the little feelings away from the big outbursts, one step removed, that's when we're going to start making headway. A person may be always highly sensitive, even into their adult years. They might have autism or ADHD or sensory processing disorder. But this mixing, this tempering of emotions can still develop. We all have the potential to grow out of our impulsiveness at least a little bit.
I remember when our daughter was younger, and she's quite sensitive on the scale, quite highly sensitive. And I remember, I think she was probably around 7 or 8, and still at times very impulsive and would just kind of blow up, storm down the hallway, slam the door to her room. And I think I remember saying to you, I'm like, do you think she's ever going to grow out of this? Like, shouldn't she have, and that was before I even fully understood all of this about the prefrontal cortex. But she has. I mean, there are moments she gets frustrated, but now it's more like, a moment or two, and she clenches her fist and then can move forward. So there's definitely been development and growth, maturity.
So another part of the brain's development is the forming of the corpus callosum. This is the bridge between the 2 hemispheres, the 2 parts of the brain. So between 3 and 5, these hemispheres are differentiating in their function. Once they've developed, now it's time to bring those signals together at the same time. The white matter in the corpus callosum has to grow. So we need both sides of the brain to solve complex problems. And this growth continues to link and develop, even to the mid and late 20s. Humans have this extended period of time, this extended length in which they develop so as to be shaped by experience and environment. Therefore, it's critical for our children to have the right environment, free from impediments and conducive to growth. And we'll talk more about this throughout this session. They need to be free to be able to have their mixed feelings. And for all this growth and development, the child needs the healthy diet, the exercise, lots of sleep. I'd like to look at some of the signs of the non-integrative. And here we're talking about emotional integration. The first one is to having pure emotions, having only one emotion at a time. Perhaps if you're a preschooler, you're totally in the moment. We expect to see that. If they're excited, they're totally full of excitement. If they're alarmed, they're full of alarm. We see this in the tantrums. We see this in the pure joy that they have. However, when we enter the school ages, the school years, we lose these pure emotions. We start to get a mix of emotions. So for teenagers, they perhaps think there's something wrong with them. They have this state of being of two minds. But being of two minds is not a weakness. No, it's a strength. This inner conflict enables us to find the answer to many of life's challenges. And in a lot of young adults today, we see them searching for this experience of purity of emotion. So one example that we've seen is in contemporary music, in the tendency towards large concerts. We see an expectation of a personal encounter with God, an experience of receiving a blessing. Now, some participants say they need a first worship fix from this. This is a language of addiction. So all too often they're seeking this like caffeine-like jolt of emotional bliss because you have this audio-visual experience. They go from concert to concert rather than finding a church, finding a home. So we could be numbed out by this wall of sound and images. It's certainly amazing to have all of these lights in these big concerts. But we're anonymous. We don't know the pilgrims next to us on this journey. We're not sharing life together.
And so you're saying they're seeking out just this purity of emotion.
Yeah.
Because of how the experience goes.
Yeah.
Because worshiping God, that's a good thing.
It's a good thing in the context of family, of knowing the people around you.
Because on their own, what?
We're not living life.
We're not maybe faced with the emotions of, well, on the other hand, how do I handle the struggles of my life?
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we also see a swing of reactions here. So if we're only having one emotion at a time, we're likely to see a swing, living totally in the moment, being driven by the external forces around us. Likewise, those without integration will not get the concept of work to be able to make sacrifices to that goal. So we expect for a child to not really get this. They don't understand work. They don't understand that down the track somewhere there'll be a reward if they put in the effort now. They can't hold on to both. And even for us as adults, work isn't very fulfilling for us either. For most of us, not all the time. But we can simultaneously experience both our desire for the outcome and the discomfort in the work that's required to get there.
Sort of that idea of delayed gratification.
Yeah.
Right? And you can see that the goal is worth the effort and the hard work.
Yeah. Another sign is the dogmatic. So someone who doesn't doubt their own perceptions, their own opinions, their own beliefs. This especially comes out when someone's challenged. If you see them doubling down, for religion, for politics, it's not our doctrine or a set of beliefs that are dogmatic, it's the maturity. It's how we explain it and how we live it out. We'll see a child who's unable to take turns, unable to share. And knowledge won't translate into action. So many of us have this idea that if a child knows better, they'll behave better. So we instruct a child, and once we do, we expect them to hold on to that, and we make them accountable for being able to behave better. However, the non-integrative child, it doesn't matter how much the child knows. If the brain is not able to hold on to that knowledge, when a new idea comes into the mind, that brain just makes a fool of them. They have no capacity to hold on. And we humiliate these children for that because We think they did it on purpose. In reality, they don't have the capacity to hold on. They feel ashamed for not being able to do so. So I remember when our son was in grade 1, and one child in particular that always interrupted the teacher. And the teacher took this child aside and said, well, the rules are when I'm talking, when the teacher's talking, no one else talks. And this little girl responded saying, yes, I get that, understand that, got it. Yeah. And then 10 minutes later, it wasn't even that. Then the teacher was talking, and this girl all of a sudden had to turn to her friend and start talking. Interrupted the teacher. What happened is an idea came into this little girl's mind, and she wanted to share it with a friend. And she couldn't hold on to the idea, even though she wanted to follow the teacher's instructions. Really, it was attached. She couldn't hold on to that other instruction that she had. She had an urge to share, and because she was single-minded, single emotion, she just shared it. She just did what was natural for her. She didn't have this capacity yet to integrate.
So how do we help younger children then, like socially, there are parameters that we need to put around situations, especially like school, where, we can't necessarily wait till they're integrated to teach them in a group setting or where there needs to be social order.
So in this case, the teacher recognized the situation, and instead of shaming and humiliating this child, she just came alongside her and redirected her, drew her attention back. So I think both the good intentions up front, plus the redirecting and gathering her, knowing that, yes, she's not able yet to hold on, not able to respond, but she will be. She will. The seeds are there.
Do you think kids, I'm just thinking about like ADHD, when it's even harder perhaps to focus or to, are we likely to see even more challenge in integrative behavior or integrative thinking and emotions?
Most certainly. This is an executive function, even in adults.
I have a friend who has, in her adult years, realized she has ADHD, which has made a whole lot of sense of her world and growing up. And she said to me recently, she's like, I apologize when I interrupt and I start talking about myself. When I maybe share a story or something I've been up to, and she'll cut in. She says, I probably sound like I'm really insensitive, but my brain has gone to, oh, this reminds me of my own story. It's her way of actually trying to relate and pay attention, but just her, I guess in this case, would it be her executive functioning is not fully integrated?
That's correct. There's potential for it, and we can help and compensate while it's growing, while this capacity is growing.
So we especially need understanding for our children and for those who have perhaps extra challenges to overcome.
And we see a black and white thinking, which is the tendency to think in extremes. For example, I'm brilliant success, or I'm an utter failure. So this polarized thinking keeps us from seeing the world as it often is, complex, nuanced, full of shades of grey.
And I think, if I can bring up here, in our Christianity, we may often have a tendency to be very black and white, and depending on our background and ways that we've been instructed over the years of our lives, we can be very, I think, prone to that very black and white thinking that I think at times the church is seen as very polarizing.
Yeah. But life is complex.
Right. And if you look at, if you really dig into Scripture, we see the complexities. We see the complexity of humanity and how Jesus approached things.
And ultimately, we have trouble mixing well with others. Yes, to socialize, we first need the capacities of integration, emergence, adaptation, all of these things to develop. Once these things are developed, yes, then we have the skills that are built on top. But these capacities underpin all of those skills that develop on top. And so without these capacities, the deficits are going to be profound. So this brings us to the fruit of the integrative process. This is what we yearn for to see in our children. Firstly, we'll see them grow in capacity to see perspective. And this goes completely against most of our work with children, when in one way or another we're saying, cut it out. Instead, we want to add something in to add in the tempering element. The cost as we grow up is we're no longer certain of our feelings when we add in a different perspective. There's always the other aspect to it. For example, perhaps you've been betrayed in a relationship and it's ended suddenly. You're cut off. You're now torn. You miss them so much, but you feel the pain of betrayal or isolation. You're of two minds. Do you go back and try and repair? Or is it time to find the futility around this? As we become aware of different possibilities, we have this inner conflict as to how to proceed. This is the key to heading towards our human potential. It's in this inner conflict. So we also see the fruit, and this is the result of integration. So perhaps we'll see courage, we'll see sacrifice, see a civilized child, patient child, cooperative, self-control or considerate. This is really similar to the fruit of the Spirit. In Galatians it says it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Let's take a closer look now at this integrative capacity bears fruit. So one of the big mixes here is alarm and desire. Our alarm system is a huge part of our physiology. Our alarm moves us to caution when we face danger, either real or anticipated danger. So here we have some alarms: to be laughed at, to appear stupid, to be seen as different, to be boring. These certainly would cause us to be alarmed when we feel these things. We also have the emergent being, filled with desires. So perhaps if we want to take part in some fun, that's the desire, but we're alarmed or afraid of being laughed at. Maybe we want to ask one question. We're in the class and we want to put our hand up, but we don't want to be stupid. That's the alarm there. Perhaps our friend is getting picked on and we want to stand up for them, but we don't want to be seen as different. We don't want to be seen as the odd one out of the group. So our hope is for the alarm and the desire to mix, and the fruit then is courage. Courage then is not an absence of alarm, but rather the realization that something else is more important to us. So it's impossible for a 3-year-old to be courageous. It might look like it, but all they've done is they've forgotten that they're alarmed because they're only feeling one thing at a time. But all of a sudden they turn 5 or 6 and they don't forget anymore about the risks. They become afraid. And the development of integration needs to begin.
So we might, as a parent or a teacher, we might be surprised when a child who wasn't afraid of swimming all of a sudden, for example, becomes afraid to jump in the water. It could be just the fact that they realize there's a risk involved. Yep. It may feel like regression of their development, but really this is progress. This is part of maturity coming to fruit.
And I remember our daughter going on the low ropes course. When we were at home and talking about it, she was excited. Mm-hmm. And then we got to the
ropes course.
Mm-hmm. And she realized that this is dangerous. And so she felt alarmed. Needed time for those emotions to mix. And it didn't mix that time.
Well, she kept going. It just took her a long time literally to get off the ground and onto the course. Mm-hmm.
So what can we do? Well, we can keep their desires alive. We can engage in activity. We can take part in things that are fun. And we can share our stories. So we make a way for them to experience life with us until they're able to find their own courage.
I think our tendency often as parents, though, might be to push our kids. Like, you can do this. You can, and say it's a lesson we've signed them up for. It's like, I paid for this. We've committed to this. We need to push through. And I think we feel we're teaching our kids a good lesson in commitment or whatever it might be. But if this process of integration isn't really functioning yet,
it'll not allow them to grow in integration. They'll
Mhm.
become numb to the situation.
Mhm. So this takes patience,
Mhm.
which means we need to have our own mixed feelings,
Yep.
right? Which is hard.
I remember when we took our youngest to swimming,
Oh, yeah, it was horrible.
one step at a time.
Yeah.
Put your
Put your
feet
feet in the
put
water.
your feet in the
That's
water.
as far as we got the first lesson.
Mm.
That's
But-
right about when he was 5,
Yep.
isn't it? 5, 6, 5. Yeah.
Mhm. It was there. He could start to feel the alarm,
Mm-hmm.
but he couldn't mix the two together.
Mm-hmm.
The desire to go swimming and the alarm. So from our discussion so far, we know that aggression is an impulse to attack. What then is the answer for this? What's the tempering effect for this? So one answer is to care about the impact of our aggression. So this allows our attacking impulses to be tempered. We don't want to receive pain, so we stop inflicting pain. The result then is self-control. So self-control is not found by suppressing or having more control over our emotions. It's not by more regulation. It's not by having the right beliefs or mindset. Rather, it's caring about the impact of our impulsiveness.
Mm.
So self-control is something we grow into. So aggression has another answer as well, is that to care about others whom we love, our attachments. For a child, we might explain it this way. You have some hits in you because you're frustrated. Do you have any hugs in you as well?
Mm-hmm. As we mentioned earlier. Yeah.
So for the very young child, they'll never say that they have these at the same time. Another emotion that will help temper aggression is alarm. This is one of the most civilizing of all emotions. Alarm is what we're hoping for when we impose consequences, yet many children today are losing their feelings of alarm. So the consequences have no effect on them. So if a child is civilized, the answer to strike or bite is, I might get in trouble. To insult or criticize is, I might trigger revenge, and so on. But if we're in too much of a rush to socialize our kids, our rules don't make any sense to them. Not at the emotional level anyway. They have no capacity to mix their feelings and follow through with the rules that we're imposing. And we set these rules up a lot in our school systems, hoping that it'll temper the aggression that we're seeing in our kids.
Because we want to see civility
That's the desire, yeah.
and we looked at self-control, but
Yeah.
we want all of that.
So the intent is good to set up rules in school.
Mm-hmm.
If you hit the other kids in school, you're going to get suspended. It's a good rule. But it only works on the child who's integrated.
And so why have our kids lost their feeling of alarm?
We've lost all our feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And alarm, there's no good or bad emotions. Alarm is telling us something,
Mm-hmm.
that there might be a consequence. That's not something that we want to do. Now, let's say we've been hurt in a relationship, perhaps. Someone's betrayed us. Our impulses to get even can be tempered by our feelings to keep close, to care for somebody. So if you've been hurt, you'll have some anger, some alarm about this. You also feel a bit of the pain of that broken relationship. Over time, that anger will subside, and with safety, the alarm will normalize. But every time you remember that situation, you'll feel some pain about it. Now, this pain will stay with you, and it ought to. But if you're integrated, it's not the only emotion you feel. You also care about that relationship. You care about that person. Yes, you get angry, but you don't indulge in the impulses to get even. So for the integrative person, this means a mixing keeps us at bay from exacting revenge, while it also moves you towards connection. This is forgiveness. If you don't have integrative functioning, to forgive means to forget. And if you can't forget, you have a big problem. So true forgiveness does not mean we have forgotten the offense. Forgiveness is when the relationship is moving towards restoration, when we're part of that movement towards restoring that relationship. And this can only happen when we have the integration of feelings. So when we talk about the development of virtues, We can see here that caring is one of the most important human emotions that we have. And we're all created with this capacity to care about that which we're attached to, whether it's outcomes or people, we care. And this caring is the root of empathy. So in Philippians, we have this verse, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. However, you never need to be taught to care. Yes, how to care, yes, but not taught to care. You see, the feelings of caring are so important, yet we don't treasure this in our children. We're consistently using what the child cares about against them. We do this to get compliance, to get our own way. We have to rethink this. So many children are saying, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Well, it's a stupid field trip anyway. They've lost their caring. As they lose their caring, we develop whole programs in schools to teach our children to care. We try and teach them empathy, but this isn't the problem. You can't teach a child to care. They just need to get their feelings back. So we want our children to care deeply and intensely. So then what are the primary impediments for integration? First, we have a lack of emergence, either the sensory development or the curiosity about the world around us. There simply is less desire or less caring about people inside the child to temper their responses.
That kind of follows up from what we just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a lack of caring, lack of empathy.
We fail to experience or deaden our temporary emotions. So, for example, alcohol is one thing that deadens our emotions. It plays a huge role in criminal activities and violence. They've done some research, and over 90% of criminal activities there's alcohol involved in some way. So therefore, the angry or violent parent then translates for a child into anger is acceptable. This is the model that they see. And they see it as the way to solve their problems. So it's not unusual to meet a child who wants to hurt others. They use the words like, I want to kill, I hate them, I want them dead. These same children hurl chairs at the teacher. They hit, they kick, they swear, they ridicule those teachers. Some children strike out at others, and at other times they harm themselves. It's all too easy then for the child to run off to television, to video games, to the friend's house or the internet. These are all poor substitutes for experiencing our temporary emotions.
And we're seeing this because we don't have integration.
We don't have those temporary emotions, that integration, yeah. We're seeing all of this coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is certainly escalating in our times.
Mm-hmm.
We see it in school at the moment, after COVID. We see the children are no longer attached or caring for their teachers because they've been on remote learning and they're not connected anymore. So they attack their teachers when they come back to school. They've got no connection. And we see parents also, since COVID, the increase in parent to teacher attacks. Parents are attacking teachers because they're not feeling connected to schools anymore. They don't feel like teachers are part of their own community.
And so caring is the natural response to our attachments.
Yes.
So you're saying if we have a lack of appropriate attachments, we have a lack of caring.
We have a lack of caring, a lack of tempering of our responses.
Mm-hmm. Really creates, if you just think socially, it creates a huge problem in our world.
Our disconnect is huge right now.
Huge. Mm-hmm.
Then lastly, we have the premature pressure on social integration. And we're going to introduce the orthogenic principle here, just to understand what happens when we push socialization. So when a baby's born, they think they're part of you, that you and them are the same thing.
Because you were for a long time. As the mom.
And they don't realize that they're their own separate person. When they cry, they expect you to be there. That is not until about 6 months old. If they feel securely attached, then they are confident to explore their world at that point. Once they explore their world for a little while, they differentiate, they identify themselves as separate. They separate themselves from their parents, their family, their teachers, and even their peers. And children are meant to be inventing themselves. That's what childhood is all about. Only then can integration begin. It's not until the will develops, until they develop their own desires, their own wishes, their own interests, that then they can come along others and say, what is your desire? What's your interest?
So we sort of get it back to front, don't we?
We want to integrate. We want to have them working together before they figure out who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So our problem, obviously, is we're in a hurry. We don't understand this development. We push for the end result. We push for integration. We send children off to preschool thinking they're going to learn to be social. They're going to learn to fit in. But we forget about differentiation and separation, finding themselves.
Mm.
And differentiation certainly continues well into the mid-20s and even beyond, figuring out, even in our young adult years, what is it, who we are, how do we fit into this world?
And integration doesn't happen before 5 to 7 years or later.
At least that's even that's the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when we push this social integration, for children to get along, fitting in, to be nice, before the child knows their own mind, before they have their own boundaries, this crushes the individuality, that tentative emergence, and it leads to fusion. And you'll certainly see this among adolescents and young adults. They're being fused through coercion into a common identity. You see them talking like each other. They have the same ideas, same interests, same beliefs and convictions.
Sort of a gang mentality.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They're full of defensiveness and black and white and polarized thinking. We need to be patient. We need to remember that social integration is the last step in the process, not the first.
So how would this look different? I mean, it would change probably our whole school system. Like if we understood this, I mean, this togetherness, and differentiation and integration, it's not a one-time thing.
No, it's a continual
Right? It's a continual
process.
thing of
we differentiate, we separate, and then we respect and come working alongside others.
Mm-hmm.
So we discover more and more who we are. Then we ask questions of, who are you?
Mm-hmm. So what would that look like? I mean, obviously we aren't seeing this in most of our cultures, I would suspect.
Mm-hmm.
Or this fusion is becoming a greater challenge in our world.
It is. Where the teenager looks like their peers.
Mm-hmm.
Where the adult seeks for another group to be like them so they can fit in.
Mm-hmm. And it's very polarizing.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Which I think, if we look politically, socially, like there's lots of ways we have, separated. And
find a group to belong to that is just like us.
Mm-hmm.
So we can fuse and be part of that group.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can't mix with different groups and get different spheres of people.
Different ideas.
We can't mix intergenerationally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're really setting our kids up, unfortunately, not for integration.
We're not.
Mm-hmm.
So separation and differentiation needs good attachment. And we look at this more in session 5.
Which is something like, say, for example, my question of our schools,
Yeah.
the stronger the attachment with the adults, the greater chance for integration.
The greater chance for them both to find out who they are, explore the world, to be curious, and then to integrate.
Mm-hmm.
So compensating for immaturity and priming integration. Here, I've just put up a few practical examples of how we might compensate for this immaturity and perhaps prime the integration to get it started. So for immaturity, of course, if we see the child as immature, rather than seeing them as a little adult who just needs to be put into shape, we see them as someone who's still growing and developing, who's still going through these processes of developing their human potential. We can anticipate the symptoms, so we can allow time in the morning to say, yes, it'll take time to transition, time to move into the next activity, time to gather them. They won't just gather as soon as I call them. And adjust our situations. So routine and structure obviously is a great way to set our agenda, to have the child anticipate what's next. Collecting before directing, to warm up the relationship. We'll talk more about that in session 6. And we'll script behavior to give them something to mimic. Again, scripting behavior, getting them to say please and thank you, is not growing up. It's not integration itself, but allows them to be part of an experience until they themselves have grown up. And then to prime integration here, a right relationship with a caring adult, because that's where emergence starts. And then to soften the heart, to make it conducive to feel again, to create shame-free zones or to shield them from wounds and separation. Because it's a soft heart is where we grow, where we bring together big emotions, where we can process and integrate those things that are moving us. And then leading ever so gently into vulnerable territory, touching on bruises, touching on the disappointments in life, affirming the feelings, affirming them separately before bringing them together. And as we've mentioned a few times, to solicit good intentions. Here, getting the child to aim in the right direction. So once we know this development takes time, that needs the conditions to be conducive, so for us to meet their needs, to act as a buffer and to control the timing, to not give too much instruction. And for the emotions to not be too intense, well, ideas will come to us of what to do. And today, we trip all over immaturity. We don't see it. We don't even ask, is the child ready for this? We assume they have the capacity before it's actually there. But now we know how development unfolds. We'll have lots of ideas. Lots of ideas should come to us as we think about this, of what to do. Thanks for joining us in this session, and we look forward to seeing you session 4.